take your empty lot in life and crush it. Squeeze, 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 not butter. Extremely Serious Wrestling goes all in every month. If it weren't for one perfectly timed Japanese gummy candy investment, I'd be through.
Thank you, Hollywood, and God bless.
Live from my grandmother's basement and a sunny, studio apartment in Los Angeles?
It's a 2-bedroom.
A sunny 2-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles, California. We are the only Chris Gethard Presents podcast, and I'm Emily Pineapple.
And I'm Forrest, the keeper of the Canon.
And we have a very special guest with us today from sunny Los Angeles, Uncle B.
Oh, Uncle B, back on the We Are Trash People podcast. Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course, and especially today, because we are going to be talking about episode 402, CLON 3, Song of the Summer, but more specifically about its main dude. I don't even know how to categorize this person. We're talking about Brian Fungalhead himself, Justin Angermeyer, who is all about wrestling, professional and non-professional wrestling. And this is a thing that I know zero things about.
And I know some things about.
And I've heard that you know all of the things about.
Not all of the things, because if Justin or anybody like Justin is going to listen to this, they know far more things than I do. But I at least have an upbringing within wrestling of having watched it and having it meant a great deal to me, like it did to a lot of people. And I can talk about a great deal of things, but there are certain subsects and details of the wrestling world that I certainly don't know as much as hardcore fans.
Mine is mostly around the Invasion era, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, learning about. I'm so sorry.
I'll talk Invasion era with you for as long as you want, but we really shouldn't. It's very boring.
Also true.
Well, why don't we get started talking about CLON 3, Song of the Summer, and Justin Angermeyer, the performer himself, the individual, the man behind the fungal head. And this is, why don't we get into the description? The description of CLON 3 from Twitter: a baroque billionaire and his spaced out robot must reunite to change the world one more time in CLON 3, Song of the Summer, with Riley Soloner.
And, I mean, you're here, so it's going to be weird to refer to you in the third person, but per your Q&A with Riley, the official snack is peanut butter-based snacks, like apple with peanut butter on it, or a peanut butter cup, and there will be a call, but we don't know the topic.
Yeah, apparently...
No promises on calls.
There may be a call. That's a good...
Yes.
That's a good clarification.
And we thought that because this is CLON 3, the third time we have seen CLON. The first time we talked about Riley Soloner. The second time we talked about Riley Soloner's social media. 3, I want to just congratulate myself right now on the amount of times I have said Riley Soloner and not Riley Solomon.
Yes, that was an issue. Just misspeaking and misnaming our audio files.
You know, at least I didn't call him Jason, like in all of my early notes.
Hey, at least your audio was recording for you to say it wrong. I can't say for a lot of my early Gethard universe contributions.
Oh my gosh, I just listened to your interview with Bethany, and Keith gave you a hard time about something like that. Did you interview Keith and not record it?
No, I recorded my interview with Keith. Keith was probably making fun of the time that I flew out to New York to interview Chris and didn't record. Because Keith was the one that set that up for me very kindly. So if he was giving me shit about audio not recording, it was because he had helped me out for weeks to plan this trip out to interview Gethard, and I just didn't record it.
That's incredible. Well, it's like improv. It's ephemeral. It only happened that one night. It will never happen that same way again.
Well, no, it didn't even stream anywhere. It was a conversation between Chris and I that never got released or seen by anybody other than Chris and I in the room.
So it's like like a really small black box theater. Like the most intimate theater experience possible.
It's like running sides with your friend before your audition. And your friend was very kind to come over and take time out of their day when they were deathly ill, and that you just didn't show up to the audition the next day.
Oof. Oof.
The whole video, I recorded video of my conversation with him. There's just no audio. So if you can find it on YouTube, completely silent interview with Chris Gethard. That's out there on YouTube. And it's just Chris and I sitting and having a nice chat, but you can't hear what we're talking about. And then I put in distant thunder noises, but we're not here to talk
I
about
love that.
Yeah, I love it. I love that.
That is in itself an art piece, I believe.
this. Sure.
No, truly,
Sure.
it's about the power of failure. Right?
I bought
No, yeah.
some. I bought some copies of Gethard's book "Lose Well," and he signed in them "Fix the Sound." Geth. That's what I have. But let's move on.
Yeah. Okay.
Back to talking about Justin Angermeyer. Yeah, so we wanted to talk about Justin Angermeyer because we've seen 3 clones. Well, we've seen 2 clones. And in each clone, we have had our 2 staple characters, Clon himself, Riley, and Brian Funkelhead, as portrayed by Justin Angermeyer. Brian Funkelhead, the bumbling billionaire who is just fucking hilarious and has the best voice. And I want to hear him voice all of the cartoons constantly all the time. Does he have a podcast?
Not that I've been able to find. He's been on some podcasts, but I haven't found one of his own. But I do think he has, like, his voice is so perfect. His voice is so great.
He has such a good voice. It's like, it's very identifiable. It's very, like, cool to listen to. He can be so expressive with it. So here's Justin Angermeyer. Justin Angermeyer, he is an Astoria-based comedian who performs stand-up comedy all over the city and has studied improv at the UCB Theater in New York. Where did we get this bio?
That bio was from a show he did.
Very cool.
And I will pull that up while you...
Yeah, and we have...
Okay, I found it. It was from his show with Caitlin McKee at QED.
Oh, cute. But yeah, so we have 15 things that we love from Justin Angermeyer. Do we have 15 things, or did I just
No,
oversell?
You just oversold, because basically XSW itself is like a huge chunk of the list because it's so dense and it's the whole world of XSW.
That's Extremely Serious Wrestling.
Yes, that's Extremely Serious Wrestling, which we want to use because he's such a big part of it, and it's one of his main places where he shows off and his creativity and it performs as a character. So we wanted to use this episode about him to also talk about XSW in a broader way.
Yeah.
And it is dense enough to be a lot of a list.
And basically its own episode.
Oh, yeah.
Honestly.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so let's talk about the first thing. There's a video of him doing stand-up. What year was this from?
What year is it from?
Yeah. But it's really great. He talks about wrestling. He talks about getting teased.
It was from 2016.
2016. So it's kind of cool because in these videos, like, there's a lot of very old videos of Justin on YouTube. So it felt a lot more than a lot of the other people we've watched. Like, we're watching him grow up. It's more like Riley, because like Riley has videos from freaking high school where he was like doing characters and vlogs and stuff. So it did feel like that. Like, we're sort of watching him grow up.
Well, it's cool seeing how wrestling is such a big part of his stand-up set as well. Mm-hmm. And you really can see, and it's also a part of a few of his podcast appearances, so you really can see how central it is as an interest and then also as XSW and his comedy career.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll mention something unique to Justin in that I think with CGP as an overall project, I think Justin is a good example of somebody that didn't come from the like old Gethard universe of TCGS. You had a lot of familiar characters coming out of that, and you would have expected them to show up on CGP. So you have your Rileys, you have your Connor Ratliffs, but Justin is one of these individuals that has had their own place within CGP that's brand new of being this larger community of performers that have come onto shows and just completely stolen the show. And so that's one of my favorite things about CGP is seeing somebody like Justin or like Rachel, who did Daddy Suave on Elegance Hour. You have some of these bit players from episodes that end up becoming like huge favorites amongst people that watch the show. And that's some of the secret sauce of CGP as well, is that it's not just who you're getting as your host. We're opening up a whole element of all of these additional performers who are going to be on the show and just kill it.
Absolutely. And it's really fun that we get to see like the people that we love make things with. Which sort of brings us to our number 2, the podcast I Was Scared Too, which is a horror podcast hosted by Kid Cinema, Mitchell Stephen Fesh. Fesh, who was brought out by Gethard. He's like a kid from the Midwest. What is this story? Forrest, tell us, Canon Keeper.
He's from Ohio originally, and Gethard did I think it was a contest where he flew someone out to give them the best day of their life. And Fesh won. And so he got flown out to, I am not vamping at all right now.
Not at all. Well, he took him to New York City, took him around, introduced him to a bunch of people, and then lo and behold, Fesh came to New York City, and is doing a bunch of cool stuff, is like BFFs with Riley.
So yeah, Gethard flew him out, and he was the guest of honor at a show at UCB where people like Jack McBrayer, Donald Glover, Ellie Kemper, and Zach Woods were all there. Shit. And it's amazing. And now he's such a key part of New York comedy, and especially this world. And I mean, Riley even mentioned in the Q&A that Fesh had helped him write for CLON.
Yeah.
Which was super interesting because I didn't know that. And
he also founded Xtremely Serious Wrestling,
yes.
Which of course is where Justin Angermeyer and Riley met. And yeah, so this is a really fun podcast. I love horror movie podcasts because I hate watching horror movies, but I want to know all of the details in the plots of horror movies, but I don't want it to be described in too scary of a way. Because then I will be scared. And
this podcast was great for that. The episode of it that we listened to that had Justin on it had Justin as Captain Celluloid on a November 1st, 2019 episode that was all about Saw 7, the final chapter. And what was cool was they broke down what the traps were.
Yeah.
So you got to know that the gruesome details of what people had to go through to become better people if you buy what Jigsaw says, which is a point of contention on the show, if he's honest about his motives or not. You got to know it without having to see it. So I didn't have to see some of the real bloody stuff that's in that.
But I know the bloody stuff that did happen, and I can be like, ooh, this is the perfect amount of gore for me, which is like distant theater of the mind that I listen to while I'm doing something else and hearing a comedian say it. And then what I'll do is I'll look up the scary parts of the movie on YouTube, but I'll play it on my phone and I'll put it away from me and also be doing something at the same time as I'm watching it.
It's also just one of the really cool things is you get to hear the, not to completely move on from your
That's okay.
thing,
That's okay. It's just me in horror movies. This has nothing to do with
It's really cool to hear the chemistry between Fesh and Justin because you can tell that they've worked together a ton. Like they do a Whose Line Is It Anyway style hoedown in the episode.
Heidi, ho. It's really fun.
And then they also sing Barbie Girl.
Yes.
It's great. Definitely check this out. It was a really fun podcast. But our third thing is the UBWO, the Union Beach Wrestling Organization, which was when Justin was like 16 or 17, he and his friends ran like a wrestling league, like a little federation. And they did the way they actually structured it so that there were 4 shows building up to a major event on a regular basis. And some of those major events were Revengeance, September to Remember, and Retribution. And you can actually see these clips on YouTube. They look like they were shot on like a camcorder.
Because they probably were.
Those are such wrestling pay-per-view names. I just have to say.
And the way that they structured it is so like I was listening to them talk about this and I'm like, wow, that is some real dedication from high schoolers. Like that's like awesome levels of shit. And then I learned more about wrestling history, and I'm like, oh my God, they were just doing the thing.
Yeah, no, they were really, like, they were perfectly, like, as close as the high schoolers can come to, like, mimicking the structure of WWE storylines. Like, one of the characters part of his gimmick was he would get dropped off, or he would arrive into the arena, quote unquote, which was someone's backyard, a different way each time.
Because, like, the gimmick was that he was homeless.
Yeah.
So he's coming from a different place each time.
And so,
Like, he's dropped off by a truck.
Yeah, that was the one I was going to bring up, is he just got dropped off by a truck and then walked into the ring. And, like, that was his entrance. And you can see a best of video that Justin made as well, which is full of, like, one great pun that he uses so effectively.
And he has, like, this is the thing that I enjoy about wrestling in particular that I can identify off the top of my head. It's fun athletics. He's really good at those moves. Like, it's just a fun, acrobatic, superhero-esque show where it's like, that probably wouldn't hurt someone even if it was, like, really done. But it looks fucking great.
Yeah, no, and they sell all the moves like pretty like they sell the moves so well that before I learned that they were actually doing the scripting and everything, I was legitimately like, oh no, that looks like that kid just like got hurt.
Well, that reminds me of the 90s. Like, there was this whole thing about kids doing backyard wrestling and really fucking each other up.
One, yeah. And then actually, it turns out there was a wrestler in this league who was never able to get over because he hurt someone's little brother every time they wrestled. So they were like, well, we're never going to give you a big moment because you're hurting this kid.
No. He was doing it on purpose?
No, I don't think it was on purpose. I think it was just like...
He just couldn't get his shit together.
It's tricky to nail the move so that they look like painful and are sold super well, but aren't actually like hurting someone.
Yeah.
And it's like especially tough for a teenager where you're already like a little gangly and not going to be as coordinated as you might want to be as an adult.
One can hope.
It's a terrible thing to put your body through.
Also that, yeah, in general.
Well, wrestlers say that you only have so many. So when you fall on the mat, that's referred to as a bump. And so there's a specific way to fall on the ground. You're supposed to land on your back and also sort of slap your arms onto the mat, and that helps sort of defer the impact. But what wrestlers say is that everybody has a personal limit as to how many bumps they have in their life, and you don't know what that is.
Until you've hit it.
Until you've hit it. But yeah, that's why where you were saying the 90s thing with backyard wrestling and kids like hurting themselves, that was a big thing because like kids just really fucking loved it, and they would tear each other to shreds in backyards.
Fuck, man. Fuck. Well, before we get more into that, we have our fourth thing that we love that Justin has done, and that is, of course, Brian Fungalhead, the super successful, the most successful CEO and creator of CLON. And the amount that he reminds me of individuals that are just walking around San Francisco right now is startling.
No, yeah. Fungalhead is an amazing character. And he sells it so perfectly. Like, I just love it. He's so, I've met him.
We've met these people in San Francisco. They're like sure that they have like the next big thing. They're like talking about it to everyone. They have like super inflated thing. They haven't done jack shit.
I've definitely ridden the bus with fungal heads, and they're the guys who are on their cell phone shouting into it about how they have to get VC funding while I'm just sitting there trying to listen to my podcast and can't hear Beautiful Anonymous because they're just shouting right next to me into their phone.
Taking lifts
it's also,
with them.
Like their harebrained ideas they are fully invested in, so it can't not work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that desperation is such a key part to the fungal head character. And like, I think really if you want to just watch a little bit to know everything you need to know about Brian Fungalhead, it's that opening bit of CLON where he's looking into the mirror and like talking a big game, hyping himself up about how he's a strong, hot guy that everyone loves, and then just starts crying to himself.
It's like the amount of dudes we see in CrossFit gyms being like this. Oh, gods. Oh, gods. But I think that something really fun about his character that I didn't realize until watching a bunch of wrestling things is how much like a wrestling persona Brian Fungalhead has, and how his status changes so often throughout all of the shows, like throughout each of the shows, and then throughout them as an arc. Like at first he's like on top of the world, he's like the most powerful guy, and then he gets completely like crushed by CLON, and he's second to CLON. And then in the second episode, he's, being forced to do push-ups.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good point. Like, I think that the status changes are a key thing that it has in common with wrestling storytelling in general, and how that functions is there's just so many twists and turns and betrayals. Like the Marla betrayal is also straight out of that, and then having them like have to meet each other again face to face after the betrayal is perfectly like there's like I can see the DNA of it, which is also just storytelling DNA, but it does specifically evoke it to me. And the way he stands, like the way Brian Fungalhead stands even is he reminds me a lot of Vince. Like I remember when I first watched it, he reminded me of Vince McMahon, the CEO of the WWE, before I knew that he had the wrestling tie and that Fungalhead was played by Justin Angermeyer or anything like that. And it's we'll talk about that a little bit more with XSW, but yeah, the wrestling DNA is there.
Well, and Brian Fungalhead as a character would make a perfect wrestling manager from like the 1980s.
Oh yeah.
So like the agent that is the like person that brings a big beefy wrestler down to the ring, and it's usually an older person with a suit. Paul Heyman, when he was this character back in the day, he would have like a big one of those big like Saved by the Bell type cell phones. And his thing was that he was always on the cell phone. Brian Fungalhead is straight from that sort of DNA too. Like when they did the promo during Ghoul Train and Brian Fungalhead was speaking on behalf of CLON, that was in the same exact format of how wrestling promos in the 1980s were. You would have your speechless tough guy who was CLON, and then you would have their mouthpiece manager, which was Brian Fungalhead, and he would just make a perfect 1980s manager.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, but I hadn't thought about the similarity with the promo to wrestling promos and specifically in the 80s. That's
because CLON has always been presented as a little more like aggressive and like bad boy, especially with his entrance in $1 Billion Bonkies. That's definitely wrestling related because he comes out to like theme music and fog and everything. But Brian Fungalhead being like the more businessy guy, he could, there is some DNA of being like an actual pro wrestler, but there is, in my opinion, equal parts of like a manager sort of professional wrestling role. Yeah,
I think that's definitely accurate. I didn't see it, but now that you bring it up, I think that, I definitely see that DNA there. And I think that that's definitely a stronger part of that, which is interesting. I think that might be part of why Vince came to mind, because he like walks that line between both.
The next thing that we loved about Justin was he made this thing. Is this on social media primarily, correct?
He promoted it a lot on social media. The
That's
video
where I watched it.
On both like Twitter and stuff and his YouTube page.
It's the first annual Justin Angermeyer Movie Awards. It's a premiere award show for the film industry in which he shares with us the movies that he liked. I
do like that he gave Last Black Man in San Francisco more attention than the actual Academy, because it got snubbed, and this isn't a bit, I'm legitimately frustrated that movie got snubbed.
Yeah, that was a beautiful movie. But this one also reminded me a lot of like the wrestling things that you have had me watch. He's big on theatrics. He's big on set and physical theatrics.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think that the bravado that he has in this is also very specifically wrestling, and it gets under. Well, it doesn't even get undercut. It's in the way it often does. It's just this character. Yeah, you're right. I know I've just said a lot of nonsense words to get to. You're correct, but that's what happened.
The next thing is another podcast that he was a guest on, The Best There Ever Was, produced by the Curtain Jerks, where all they do is talk about professional wrestling.
And Justin was on an episode about the match between Bret Hart and the British Bulldog at SummerSlam 1992, and it's part of their overarching series about Bret Hart. And they point out that you can see real-life frustration between the two, in part because they were actually, like, the British Bulldog was Bret Hart's brother-in-law.
Oh,
like,
shit.
real-life brother-in-law.
And did they have real drama?
Yes.
What was their drama?
Well,
Okay,
yeah, maybe
Uncle B, I think
might
you're
can fill
right.
this in, potentially.
I do really like gossip.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to know the Bret Hart British Bulldog beef of around SummerSlam 92. However, it sounds like if you listen to this podcast, you might get filled in.
You will get filled in. It involves that British Bulldog, according to that podcast, may have been on crack and not really remembering what moves he was supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so Bret had to kept having to do. There was some specific move they had to do that got their faces close enough that Bret could be like, okay, now we're going to do this. So Bret was walking him through the Bulldog through the match, and it was in England.
Ooh.
And so he was having to walk him through the match. And they say that the way in which that influences the storytelling in the match itself is interesting because Bret is playing a bit of a heel, i.e. the bad guy in this, in a way that it just works perfectly, that having him be in control of the match the whole time.
That's fucking lucky that it works out when you're trying to walk someone who's tasked with physically harming you, who is on crack.
Well, not supposed to actually physically harm you, though.
Yeah, but get pretty fucking close.
Yeah. And on the podcast.
Yeah, the whole thing about the professional wrestling is that even though it's supposed to be choreographed or like a ballet, you're still entrusting the other person with your safety.
I was literally gonna say it's like being a ballerina and expecting your dude to catch you when you jump, but he's on crack.
I was gonna say that's even scarier. Yeah. It's not someone on crack trying to hurt you. It's your safety is on someone on crack trying to help you who has real life beef with you.
Oh, Jesus Christ. This is so much like ballet.
Oh, yeah.
I did ballet as a child, and hearing about these wrestlers, it's like, oh yeah, and then they're injured at this point, and this was injuring them, and then this and that, and then they had concussions. I'm like, oh, so you mean every ballet dancer? Even fucking 12-year-olds?
Are ballet dancers getting concussions?
If they fall.
All right.
It's more about broken legs and knees
and your feet
and not eating enough.
Ballet
is definitely physically demanding.
And on the podcast, Justin talks about his first wrestling memory, which involves Mr. Perfect, and I'll let you listen so he can fill you in on that. He lists some of his favorites, including Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, Edge, Christian, and The Rock, because he loved watching these funny guys be funny, which I think is interesting given his role in Xtremely Serious Wrestling. And then just more, they give a really good bio about Bret Hart and the Hart family. So if you want to learn more about all of that, including a little bit about Owen Hart, you should listen to that podcast.
To the point of funny guys being funny, so on that list there was Kurt Angle, and something of note with Kurt Angle, legit gold medalist amateur wrestler. Yeah. Right? And so then he was recruited by the WWF to come over and be a professional wrestler. He was initially hesitant towards it. I'll spare you some backstory of how he ended up becoming a professional wrestler, but ultimately he becomes a professional wrestler. He's a gold medal athlete. And then what he's most known for is he was feuding with Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he comes out to the ring they were having Stone Cold Appreciation Night. Stone Cold was a bad guy. Stone Cold had all these people in the ring celebrating him, and Kurt Angle's music hits. Kurt Angle drives out in a milk truck and pulls out a hose and sprays Stone Cold Steve Austin and everybody in the ring with milk.
Yep.
And then he gets up on the top of the truck. He pulls out 2 cartons of milk, and then he smashes them together and then proceeds to pour them down his gullet. And that happened in Sacramento, California. And a young Bryson Wallace was in the audience.
You were there.
Now,
Wow.
I was there. I was there at that show. That's what Kurt Angle is most known for. Kurt Angle, when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, his like overall theme of his speech at his Hall of Fame induction was he was trying to give younger wrestlers the message of don't take yourself too seriously. If anything, he's the prime example of that. He could have come in and he could have been like, I'm tough shit. I'm a gold medalist. He could have had the biggest ego of his life, and he probably had his own stuff here and there, but he wasn't one to like say, I'm better than that idea. And so if they threw anything at him, he'd be game to try it out. And so Kurt Angle, who had no right to be as funny as he was, had like some of the funniest stuff in the early 2000s, just because if you put a gold medalist in a position where he had to wear a tiny little cowboy hat that was like 5 sizes too small and sing on guitar with Stone Cold Steve Austin, Edge and Christian, they were known for playing the kazoo backstage, and Kurt Angle would join them and just play kazoo with them. And so here I am. I've talked how long about professional wrestling? At what point did I mention any wrestling moves whatsoever? The things that we take away from these guys and what Justin probably speaks to him about these guys from seeing these funny guys be funny is just the stuff that they did outside of the ring that made them just as endearing characters.
Well, it's funny because the other thing that I know Kurt Angle for, the second thing, is also not a move he ever did. It's that when his music goes do-do, do-do, and so I don't remember when it happened, but at a certain point, the crowd just started chanting, you suck, as he walks out, to the point that I was watching videos in preparation for this, and they had him come out as like, oh my God, it's the legend Kurt Angle. And the crowd still goes, you suck, even though like they're cheering for him. Yeah, everyone loves him, but that's just what you do when Kurt Angle comes out.
I now see the Gethard connection.
Yeah. Chanting unites both fandoms in a really profound ways.
Chanting and like absurdity.
Yeah.
And feuds.
Oh yeah. Well, and you talk about like Gethard's whole thing was whenever they had guests on the old Gethard show, he wanted it to be not like them pandering to a celebrity. They always wanted it to be a celebrity coming into the world of TCGS, you know, to become part of like, you know, it's like a leveling playing ground on the old TCGS. And there's sort of that aspect with wrestling too, is like there are these big characters, but ultimately no one of them is higher up than others because they can all be in the same segments. They can all have wins or losses over one another. There's sort of this ebb and flow of, you were saying status before, which is sort of what plays into it. But yeah, sort of like a hierarchy of like who has an advantage over another.
I like that point a lot. I mean, I hadn't made that comparison, but I think that's really good. I mean, because you're right. I mean, any wrestler theoretically can take down another one, sometimes a surprise attack, or even just anyone can actually legitimately beat anyone. And that's a oddly level playing field for...
It's like Game of Thrones. You never know who's gonna die.
And to the TCGS point, it's also like if anybody comes to a wrestling show, it's never that a celebrity, like when you go on the Tonight Show, it's more so like spotlighting the celebrity. Whereas if you came on TCGS, or like if a celebrity comes to Monday Night Raw, it's more so that they have now entered the world of TCGS or WWE, and not that they're being put on some other level.
That reminds me of when Mr. T came into the WWE and essentially served as Hulk Hogan's hype man.
Yeah.
And when Jon Stewart went into the WWE and like did a Daily Show themed segment where he like surprise attacked someone. You're right. Yeah. The WWE universe like it's them entering that, which is cool because it's not what I would have expected for a show where any celebrity can just hop in at any moment.
Yeah.
And speaking of wrestling worlds,
Yes.
our next thing is Xtremely Serious Wrestling, which is its own awesome, fun world. So the out-of-universe origin, of course, out-of-universe meaning out of the universe of Xtremely Serious Wrestling, not out of this universe, though one can question the nature of the universe. So Mitch Fetch, yo, my brain is always on a lot of levels. Most of them about the nature of the universe.
Yeah, no, let's talk about a wrestling federation.
Yes. So Mitch Fetch, he is from Ohio. He loved UCBW videos when he was in high school. And he started doing UCBW shows and felt frustrated because he felt like no one was taking it as seriously as he was. What the fuck is UCBW?
It was UCB Wrestling. It was
Okay,
it was
that's what I
their
thought.
wrestling show, and this all is from a appearance that Fesh made on the show Jerking the Curtain, where he also talked about how important continuity is to XSW. That sense of the storyline is building week after week is key, and that they intentionally blend parody wrestlers, original wrestlers, jokes for people who used to watch wrestling, others for ones who currently do still, and then also ones that work for everyone, regardless of if they've ever watched wrestling. And I think that comedic balancing act is also just so important. And I think they nail it. Like, we were both watching, and
we literally had to ask Justin Angermeyer if he was the person who ran Xtremely Serious Wrestling, because we're like, no, but like, we know that this guy Fesh like did it, but then whenever we look shit up about it, it's always talking about Justin Angermeyer running it, and we're like, what is happening? It's because he's the character that runs it.
Well, because the kayfabe is that Serious Justin Angermeyer is the owner and founder of Xtremely Serious Wrestling. Kayfabe
being the fake shit.
It's when scripted elements are treated as real. Like, when so there was a WWF, I think it was after that, whatever, WWE show where Vince McMahon was in a limo that blew up, quote unquote, and the show treated it as if Vince McMahon actually was blown up before it was revealed he wasn't. But so that's a bad example because it's revealed he wasn't. It's like a lot of characters are paired off in romantic relationships and stuff where their characters are in a relationship in the kayfabe, but they're not actually together at all. Or like if...
Yeah, the easiest way to describe is the kayfabe is the fictional universe.
Yeah.
Like the phrase that's used is you got to keep kayfabe, meaning like if you and your best friend in real life, if you guys are feuding on TV, you guys have to keep kayfabe, meaning you guys can't hang out outside of work.
Yeah.
Like you guys can't go to be seen at the gym together because you're feuding.
Yeah, wrestlers in public have to keep up appearances that is actually true.
It's so interesting, like taking the art to the paparazzi. And like to this idea that we're always being watched. And it's like, where does performance end, you know? Which was interesting because Riley Soloner was talking about how he likes doing like completely immersive in character things.
Well, and it's interesting also for Justin because Justin even has taken performing as Serious Justin Angermeyer to Reddit.
Oh, yeah.
Where on the Squared Circle subreddit, he asked for advice because he was about to lose his company to his nephew in a match. Like there was a match where the company was on the line. What is your suggestions for how I can beat my nephew in this match?
And his nephew is played by, I forget his name.
Kevin Allen, who played Fitness Expert Warrior 2 on $1 Billion Bonkies.
Yep. So the kayfabe of Xtremely Serious Wrestling was that it was founded by Serious Justin Angermeyer after making a name for himself on the Union Beach indie circuit. He decided he was fed up with what professional wrestling had become, a joke and a shell of what it once was. He set off to make a promotion that would change wrestling forever. Beginning in September of 2017, Xtremely Serious Wrestling has brought an innovative brand of professional wrestling to the world through monthly shows in the greatest city in the world, I was about to say questionable. San Francisco's so great, but I don't really think San Francisco's that great. I'm gonna put Chicago in that spot of the 3 cities I've been to. All right, back to the actual.
We need to get you to more cities.
Yeah.
New York City. He thinks New York City is the greatest city. In this time, Extremely Serious Wrestling has proven that wrestling can be extreme and can be serious. That's extreme with an X.
Yeah, I was going to point out that Emily is making X signs with her arms right now as she reads this.
And here we are today. This is Extremely Serious Wrestling.
And as we pointed out, Serious Justin Angermeyer is currently no longer the owner of XSW because he lost a match to his nephew, Quinn Bickle.
Yep.
And his intern duties, Justin Angermeyer's intern duties included cleaning the bathrooms and the backstage area at XSW 26.
His special move is the Superman Punch.
And his persona, it evokes in a lot of ways Vince McMahon, where there's the, like, I run the show, I own this, I play the heel and play on the, like, I'm the out of touch rich jerk who just, like, trolls people and is mean. He also does
deep guttural voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The voice is very Vince.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And hearing him, like, these are really fun matches to watch. What I appreciate most about them is their dedication to complete lunacy and how safe everyone is.
Yeah, like there was one match where 2 wrestlers got on a ladder and the crowd was just like, be safe, be safe, be safe.
It's like, these are fucking comedians, like, fuck that. Fuck, like, I love that they just took the things that they liked from wrestling and were like, and now it is ours.
Because that is something interesting about it, is that a lot of the more overtly comedic wrestling gimmicks were from like the 80s. A lot of the ones that are like, oh, this guy's a barber. That's his whole thing, is he's a barber who shaves people's heads when they lose.
That's so Chris Gethard show.
Right. But a lot of that is from the 80s. So, some of it doesn't hold up super great. And so it's great to have a league that's like, oh, what if you took that lunacy, but did it now? And did it with people who are trained comedians so they can sell the punchlines better than sometimes the wrestlers could.
And
Riley was hyping up on the Twitch Q&A from earlier. He was hyping up Orange Cassidy, who is an example of a comedic wrestler on the mainstream right now. So if you want to see something that speaks to Riley and presumably Justin, I don't want to speak for him, but look up Orange Cassidy, who is known as the apathetic wrestler. He wrestles, but he's not super into it.
Yeah, I would definitely second that suggestion for Orange Cassidy, because we saw him wrestle Riley in Love or Money, which was one of the XSW specials. We saw it live on independentwrestling.tv.
he is seriously acrobatic.
Oh, yeah.
Like, this dude can actually do acrobatics.
Like, I saw a video from Orange Cassidy from AEW where there's like 5 people on the ramp down to the ring, and Orange Cassidy bounces off the back rope, his hands in his pockets the entire time, and like leaps between the ropes and falls on this mass of people. Like, it's incredible.
Yeah, when I say comedic wrestling, I should establish that he's an example of somebody that's a professional wrestler who is doing a very comedic persona and has a lot of acrobatics with it. Don't mean to draw allusions between the aspect of the comedians doing the wrestling shows at XSW, but also there's crossover between the two, and there's good things to be had everywhere. There's a lot of good fun to be had in wrestling, is my point.
I agree, and I love XSW's promos that they do in addition to the actual shows. Like, there's one where Justin is standing by a lake with ducks and just goes on a rant about All In, which was one of AEW's shows. And he goes, hey, XSW goes All In every month. This isn't special for us. And like talks about how broke his character is and how he would be totally through if not for a perfectly timed investment in Japanese candy. And then, so as mentioned, he went on Reddit and asked for advice on how to handle his nephew in a match. And he got actually some advice from Redditors. Boris Holds, said, hey, what's your theory on asking a bunch of wrestling marks for advice in an upcoming shoot match, building a Ground Roots fan base? Where's the link for merch? And Justin said, I'm just a panicked man turning to anyone he can for help.
What is a wrestling mark? Just people who could be fans?
Would you? I actually know, at least via the professional wrestler Al Snow, where that term comes from, and I think you're gonna like it.
Oh, I'd
Oh
love
my
to
God.
hear that.
So, apparently, back in the days of what's it called? Just like the circus, just like traveling performers. Not vaudeville. What am I looking for here? But anyway,
Carnies.
Carnivals,
yeah, sort of that, like carny
like
culture was.
yeah.
Carny culture, and that's where like early wrestling came out of this. Wrestling really came from like if you promoted a fight, that was one way of like making money, was promoting a fight. But then they started realizing like, well, hey, if we predetermine how the endings go, we can make sure that they're very dramatic, and then people really enjoy it, and they'll come back for more. Because sometimes the fights would just be one-sided, or they wouldn't be exciting, or whatever. And so wrestling sort of came out of like this traveling, carny culture sort of thing. And a mark was somebody who was determined to be easily sold. So in carny culture, it would be for like the games at the carnival. If somebody spent a lot of money on those games, a vendor or a carny would want to pass along to everybody else that that person is susceptible to buying in. And so what they would do is they would take like a chalk or something, and they would walk past the person and mark them.
Oh.
What?
Huh.
What?
And so then other carnies would know that that's a mark, and that they are worth your energy of like trying to convince them to come and either buy your wares or use your services or play your game or whatever. So that's where the term mark comes from. The general terminology of it to this day is just saying like a wrestling fan, and it's usually used in a derogatory way of like, it's usually used either of wrestling fans talking about other ones being like, oh, you're just a mark, meaning like you sip the Kool-Aid too much. Or it'll be like professional wrestlers asserting a sort of line between them as the performers and the marks, meaning the people that pay to see them.
That's so cool.
Fascinating. And I do have a bit about the origin of wrestling as it developed through carny culture, which is super interesting. But back to...
I just want to also note
Yeah.
that Justin then went back to Reddit and updated it after he lost the company. And someone told him not to worry because, being unemployed is fine because the labor market's great for people with marketable skills, though I would recommend working on your spelling and have someone review your resume and any correspondence. You misspelled rules and extreme in this post because he said extreme without the E, like the company.
Extreme.
And then also, just to go through some of the wrestlers that stood out to us from Love or Money, which is the full show we've watched from XSW. There was, of course, Shawn from Michaels, played by Riley Soloner.
He's the make art kid. He's the art make kid?
The Art Make Kid, which is a play on Shawn Michaels, the WWF wrestler, who is the Heartbreak Kid, who his theme song has the lyric, he's just a sexy boy, and that's why he's just a crafty boy. He's also the founder of the Kinda movement, and you just have to definitely watch The Art Make Kid if you can. And there's a promo that he cut against Orange Cassidy that's on YouTube for free, and that will be in the show notes as well. And independentwrestling.tv called Shawn from Michaels legitimately one of the most entertaining performers in all of independent wrestling.
He is extremely entertaining to watch. He has to take breaks to paint a picture because inspiration strikes.
Yeah.
And so he has to paint the picture because inspiration has struck.
And he's the master of the art and craft of wrestling. And then we talked about Orange Cassidy, who was one of the other ones who stood out. And then the final one we're going to mention is Magnum, who's a dog. He's literally a dog, and he's one of the champions of XSW. He's currently their mid-card champion.
they were able to get him to like the person he was fighting took a pratfall and like got the dog to just crawl on top of him.
Yeah, and he's
good.
Officer Magnum.
Oh, of course. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it was really interesting learning about the history of professional wrestling. Because I knew nothing about professional wrestling, and now I know a lot of history facts.
Most of what I learned is from wrestling video games and then watching for a little bit.
Yeah, so we still have extremely different.
Diggity dog.
Yeah. We
That
still
was an N64 menu music.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, our frames of reference and basis of knowledge are still entirely different. But yeah, professional wrestling, essentially it was really, really popular. It started in like the 1830s in France, there was always wrestling. There was always like exhibition shows where people would fight the fuck out of each other. But combining wrestling with showmanship originates from the 1830s France, when showmen presented wrestlers under names, like cool names like Edward the Steel Eater and Gustave d'Avignon the Bone Wrecker, which I would like to adopt that. I'm Emily the Bone Wrecker, or Bonnet the Ox of the Low Alps, and then they would challenge members of the public to knock them down. And so that was a big part of early wrestling, even in the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, in America and stuff. It took off more in America right after the Civil War. And it was primarily strong men in traveling shows, in like traveling circuses. And it would be part of the strongman competition. And there was a lot of like, and any audience member who would like to challenge me, like to last 10 minutes in the ring, will win this amount of money and this and that, which meant that there were people who would go to from carnival to carnival because they were like, they knew that they could actually wrestle or fight to challenge these strongmen, which is the plot of like every anime. There is a section in every anime where there's just competitions and like dudes just come out of nowhere and they're like, I am a fighter who travels the land to fight and like gain prestige.
That's a really good point. That is like all of Dragon Ball.
It's all of Dragon Ball. I was like, oh my God, I actually care now.
Just picture them as like aliens and magical children with tails.
Pretty much. But yeah, it was introduced primarily as like a way to spice up the bodybuilder, strong men things. And during this time, they were usually athletes with like some wrestling experience. And they would go around with the carnies and the bookers. They would have managers, impresarios, and they would figure out how to get their wrestler popular. They would figure out the gimmicks. They would figure out the personas and the matches and all of that. Carnies would fight or travel around and use tricks to protect their money and reputations, and would devise wrestling moves called hooks. They're like illegal, basically, in conventional amateur wrestling because they can really fuck somebody up. And like that was their whole deal, is that they would have hooks that could just like fuck someone up in case one of these traveling Dragon Ball characters like could actually fuck them up. And yeah, I'm still kind of astounded by this now view of like post antebellum is right after the Civil War, or is it right before the Civil War? This post-Civil War
it's
America.
Occurring or existing before a particular war, so before the Civil War.
Never mind. The postbellum America with like your Mark Twains, etc., but like Dragon Ball happening.
I love that. I do love that Dragon Ball is your frame of reference, partially because that is what got me into wrestling. I was like, it's as close as I can get to like real life Dragon Ball. I legitimately, because I played the games for both, and I loved DBZ, and I was like, well, the idea that Stone Cold Steve Austin could shoot a fireball. I mean,
Oh, tight.
yeah, that'd be great. Like a flaming beer can just shoots out of his hand.
I mean, I think the lack of aliens was what really like that. And I was not allowed to watch wrestling, obviously, as a child. And I also like could not deal with simulated violence as a child because I was like afraid someone would get hurt.
I don't feel comfortable assuming that there's no wrestler who had explicitly an alien gimmick.
That's fair.
There's one right now in AEW. There's I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but one of their main female performers, her whole thing is that she's a space alien.
I love that. I love that so much. But
and also, Forrest, you should know that WWE a while back had a video game. I forget if this was like an iOS app or something like that, but there was like a Mortal Kombat style WWE game where Stone Cold Steve Austin did shoot flaming beer cans.
I haven't. I've seen it in the App Store, but I haven't played it. I think after this episode, I really want to, though.
Yeah, look it up. It might hit all of those synapses for you.
So obviously by around the 1880s, most of these shows were faked, and that's where they get kayfabe from. That's when it started. The word started occurring.
Because they started scripting.
But they kept that really secret. That was like super under wraps because people were fucking betting on this shit. So super illegal. And so wrestling took a tailspin, the popularity around like the 1915 to 1920 because there was widespread doubt of its legitimacy. But in response, that's what caused all the cool shit about wrestling besides the Dragon Ball Z that was happening. 3 professional wrestlers, these were the first folks, Ed Lewis, Billy Shadow, and Toots Mondt, joined to form their own...
Billy Sandow.
Thank you. Shadow sounds a lot cooler, so I'm going to call him Billy Shadow because he's dead. I suppose I should still respect people by calling them their correct names, even if they are dead.
Probably.
But Billy Shadow and Toots Mondt, they formed their own promotion in the 1920s, modifying their in-ring product specifically to attract fans. They were referred to as the Gold Dust Trio due to their financial success, and they were the first people to use time-limited matches, flashy holds, and signature maneuvers, including tag team wrestling.
Oh, wow.
And new tactics such as distracting the referee.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Really? That goes back that far?
Right. And that
Wow.
was instrumental to professional wrestling turning from like we're actually like fighting and, you know, fixing matches and stuff so that people can gamble to like, no, we're performing for people now. Like we're putting on a performance within this language of this world of wrestling. They also, instead of having wrestlers traveling and paying traveling performers to come, they kept all their wrestlers like for years or months at a time in one place so that they could gain popularity. And then they could have feuds.
Do you know if did the promotion travel or like was it?
No.
Okay, so they were all in one place.
I'm pretty sure that they were all in one place.
Yeah, what ultimately happened is that everywhere you can even look up maps of this. There were legit territories, and so these were the first guys. I'm taking at your word for this because I don't know this long history, but there were territories that were built off of this to where it was sort of. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like drug cartels, but it was just like this is our territory, legit, and they would travel and put on shows within their territory. But the idea is that you don't go outside of that.
Interesting.
And if you had people to contract, they were to contract to your territory. And then what happened over time, and you might get into this a little bit later, is that territories would sort of trade individuals. Like somebody would send their champion to another territory in trade of like, oh, then we get 2 of your people to come to our show just to sort of like spice things up. But that's how the wrestling business ended up evolving during this time.
And the same sort of territorial aspect was then happened when in the advent of television in the 1950s, which both made wrestling way more popular than ever before, created a lot more promotions because, people could buy time slots in different spots. And then we had the promotions battling to purchase more or less time slots in different areas.
Oh, yeah.
It was considered the golden age for wrestling, the 1950s, because it was easy to understand. It had drama, comedy, and colorful characters, and was really cheap to produce. And so that's when we sort of get more like flamboyant characters like Gorgeous George, which is, it sounds like a 1920s name.
It does sound like a 20s name.
Like Bob Hope talked about him, and it got really like popular, and then it got super oversaturated by the late 1950s. And so all of the syndicators of television started dropping their wrestling shows from their lineup. And so the remaining televised wrestling were small local syndicated shows, which were usually late night fillers rather than signature programming. And promoters would use this localized television as a weapon for eliminating their competition.
So they would just buy all the time slots, and that makes sense.
Yep. And they would
shut
just
them out.
Yeah, put them out of business.
Yeah. Wow.
And then it was the 1980s, a time which you both know a lot more than I.
This is where I start to have familiarity, like a little bit, mostly again because of video games, because there was like the old WrestleMania arcade game, and so I know some names.
Yeah, and it was
the odd to continue what you were just explaining is that the 80s. What ended up happening is that Vince McMahon, his father, who was also Vince McMahon.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I was like, how old is this human?
Yeah, no. I forget. Vincent K. McMahon is the Vince that is alive today. I forget. Vince Sr. is his father. So Vince Sr. Was running the WWF, Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And that was one of many territories. And what happened is that Vincent Kennedy McMahon, his son, ended up buying the company from him and then ended up taking it national. And what a lot of people in the old school territory system, what they thought was that Vince Jr. was going against his father's promises, which was to continue using the territory system and to not run each other out of business. But what Vince Jr. did is he ended up just going national and then squashed everybody out of business. And so a lot of people were unhappy about that during this time.
He also coined sports entertainment as the term. So he really just then set in stone, like, and this is also what wrestling looks like.
Though it's interesting because they were still, that was the scripted nature of it was still not openly acknowledged at that point, right? Because like in 1980,
not openly acknowledged until about 92, 93.
Okay.
Maybe a little later than that. Basically, there was the steroid scandal of the early 90s. And so like every wrestler was taken, brought in as a witness in a huge court case that was like the United States government versus Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And ultimately what Vince did in order to get out of that lawsuit is just openly announce everything that we do is scripted, which it was sort of still protected at this point. But in order to sort of save his ass, he came out and said, everything that we do is predetermined. Therefore, you can't hold us to the same standards as sports because we're not sports. We're sports entertainment. And so that was his point that ended up getting him out of trouble, was saying what you're holding me to is, whatever, regulations on sporting events, but we're not sporting events. We're sports entertainment.
How did this is something I did not understand. So Hulk Hogan, eat your vegetables guy, happened before Vince McMahon was like, yo, we're all fake. And I remember even as a child, people being like, oh my gosh, did you know it's all fake? Oh my goodness, they're so silly. And I'm like, there was a time when all of this like bullshit, goofy nonsense was happening and people thought that this was real. What part did they think was real? Did they think the personas weren't real, but the fights were real? Like what?
2020 did a whole expose on it in 1984. Like news stations were trying to determine if it was scripted or not. I think they knew the personas weren't real. Like they knew the Undertaker wasn't a zombie.
That's why I'm like, what is happening? What part did they think was real? What part did they not think was real?
Well, I think, like you're saying, I don't think that there was in any modern history. I don't think that there was a world in which 100% of people were like all on board with it being real. I think there was always people that either had their thoughts on it or skeptics, what have you. The aspect of him coming right out and saying what we do is entertainment. It was a video that they aired before one of the Monday Night Raws. That's why it was a big deal. Is that they opened the show with Vince coming on and being like, "I'm Vince. I'm the human, like regular human being. What we do is entertainment. It's scripted. It's no different than soap operas." And what that was not that it was like, "Oh, we duped y'all. It's all scripted." It was just more so like, yeah, you've all, kind of known, and it's not like we were keeping this big secret. It's just that we're openly admitting now for the purposes of like not being held to the standards of sports that, yeah, we're fake. Not fake. Fake's the wrong. The fake's the
scripted.
Yeah.
This is a
fake's
performance.
Not the right word.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting. It's sort of like as the world, there are more financial stakes in things, so suddenly the world like is more concerned with like, no, you have to make all of the subtext text. It's very important. But yeah, so during the 1990s, there were a lot of competing brands and nagging legal troubles. I now know what those are, thanks to you, Uncle B. And the WWF was at that point forced to change itself to overcome its competition, remodeling itself with added bloodshed, violence, and more profane, sexually lewd characters. It was the Attitude Era, quote unquote, to be more teen-oriented. And that was when I was alive. Like, that was what I knew of wrestling. Like, it was girls wearing nothing and dudes, like, actually fucking hurting themselves.
That was my main intro to wrestling was the Attitude Era. I was like vaguely familiar with the 80s stuff, like I said, from video games that were already kind of old at that point. But like, yeah, these were the wrestlers that I grew up with. Like Stone Cold was in this era. The Rock was in this era.
And we should, for anybody that's listening, because we're sort of presenting this for anybody who's listening who may not be familiar with the world of professional wrestling. We should say that this Attitude Era sort of creative direction that they went to, it wasn't made out of a vacuum. It wasn't like their brilliant idea. There was another smaller federation called ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling. It's what sort of XSW is sort of modeled after. It was this sort of like DIY underground wrestling company that did like super hardcore stuff, and like that they did the matches that had people going through tables and like barbed wire ropes and instead of ropes and all this stuff, and that was gaining more popularity. So what the WWF was running into was the WCW was their biggest competitor. They were losing in the ratings, and so the WWF had to change their creative direction. They saw what ECW was doing. That was gaining its own little following. So the WWF just sort of took over that style. And it was sort of where culture was in general, too. It was like South Park was becoming a big thing. Just sort of like crude humor in general, and like Green Day, like teeny angst and stuff like that. So the WWF, it's usually that the WWF is like a barometer of where culture in general is, you know?
Yeah, it's often chasing sort of certain following trends, not determining
either
them.
Following trends. I would also argue that there's an aspect of like it is usually in some instances like ahead of the curve of where stuff is going to be. Because like when you talk about the 80s, that was the advent of cable. And so cable defined a lot of culture. And what was one of the earliest things on cable? It was wrestling. So a lot of that like spandex neon and all of that became the culture of like popular culture, that is born out of like aspects of it born out of professional wrestling.
Wow.
What?
I'm
My
not saying entirely.
favorite color palette was determined by Hogan.
Do you really like red and yellow?
No, I like neon.
Then it wasn't Hogan.
Yeah, it wasn't Hogan. So anyway, I just say that to say that like it wasn't like Vince McMahon was like, I've got a new creative direction that I think is gonna like spark the nation. It was more so like it was like you were saying trends. It was seeing what some of his competition was acting like. WCW had their own like attitude-y sort of things coming out. The NWO was a big thing. That came before the Attitude Era. So it was like everybody wanted to be like leather jackets and like very bright denim and bad asses and like wearing bandanas and like flipping off the camera and like gesturing to your crotch.
Well, and then WCW had also hired Hogan away from WWF, where he switched from being like good guy hero to heel and became Hollywood Hogan.
Was there like
the 90s go ahead.
I was curious if there was a drive for like what caused the cultural shift from Hulk Hogan eat your vegetables to no, I want to see someone get thrown through a table and then tied up with barbed wire. To me, I'm like, oh, well, that sounds like you're searching for authenticity. You know, like you want to see something authentic the way that I'm like, oh, I want to see like an open mic because that's like authentic, you know, like it's, you know, these people don't really know what they're doing and like it could be anything. Is that what was going on, or am I just
a bit of authenticity? You're pretty spot on with that, because it was like the Hulk Hogan era was defined by, you guys mentioned it a little bit earlier, it was defined by these characters that were based off of like what occupation they had. So you had your like the go-to example is always like you had your plumber wrestler, you had you had a repo man, you had
a dentist,
Isaac
Yankem.
Thank you.
Brutus the Barber Beefcake.
So you had all of those in that like Hulk Hogan era. And then if you think about it, if you timelined out, Hulkamania Running Wild was in like 87, 88. If you timeline that out, okay, if you were a child when you were watching Hulkamania Running Wild, come 1997, you're probably in your teens.
Yeah.
And so where more cartoony characters spoke to you in the late 80s, the late 90s, what's going to speak to you is like, especially in the 90s, like teenage angst and like grunge was a big thing. And it's always going to be an ebb and flow of like how much of culture defined wrestling and then what aspects of wrestling maybe impacted culture, which it certainly did during the late 90s.
Is that why it's a little less like prevalent now? Because when I was a child, like no one I knew was allowed to watch wrestling because it was during the Attitude Era, and there were just constant exposés about teenagers like kicking the shit out of each other in backyards, and if you let your child watch these things, they're gonna, do God knows what. And so like no one I know within like my age range has those same like things with wrestling, but some of them are really into like the lucha libre stuff.
I meanwhile knew a lot of people who watched wrestling, which I think tells you all you need to know about the different areas where we grew up, though.
Yeah, that's a good point. I grew up in Marin County, which is, I don't even know how to describe this place. Like the most money in the fucking world, like, and then also the most uptight people, and also one of the strongholds of the anti-vax movement.
Okay.
This is my home. I feel like that explains everything.
I think that's a pretty good
rich ass bitches who will not vaccinate their children.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty accurate description. Whereas I was.
And if you're just joining us, thank you for listening to our Marin County podcast. We'll be going over
from
Orange
Marin.
County and Yolo County in our next episode.
Oh, Uncle B, you put so many ideas in my head just now.
To answer your point, like if you think about the timeline, and it's sort of ingenious of like catering your content to a certain generation, because they changed their creative direction to still capture the people that were children during a different era of their content. And now they were catering their content to that same subsect of people, just where they were in life in the late 90s.
It's like Harry Potter.
Sort of, I guess. I'm not a big Harry Potter person, so you'll have to enlighten me. But
like shit got way more dramatic and adult. Like the first book was all like childlike, and then as the books went on, it got like a lot darker. Like suddenly people are being murdered in the books, and like Harry has PTSD. And then, like, there's Nazis. Like, there are just Nazis. Like, there weren't Nazis in the first 3 books. And then there were Nazis.
Exactly. So, and what you get to is, like, you might get to it a little bit later with the stuff that you're going to go over. But, like, the late 90s is where it's most financially successful. Like, Stone Cold Steve Austin was selling out arenas all over the place, and he's considered to be the biggest box office draw of all time. And then when you have into the 2000s, it sort of dips off. Stone Cold retires, and then, you know, things change and everything. They have to make some adjustments elsewhere. They're still trying to do not fully Attitude Era, but still sort of the same type of thing. And ultimately what they had to do is they had to revert back to being rated PG. And they got a lot of flack for that. But if you think about it, they might have just been hitting the reset button on let's grab another PG audience. And then in 10, 15 years time, who knows, they might change their creative direction to then take those people that they grabbed at the PG era and then be with them when they're a little more reality based or teenage based, like you were saying.
Well, and then also the original kids who grew up with it in the 80s, who were the Attitude Era Degeneration X kids, are now parents who might want to share it with their children. And so it loops back and have fondness. Now it's like, oh, I remember all the goofy stuff. That's great. As opposed to, that's kid stuff.
Yeah,
no.
That's basically where my timeline ends in like around 2002. And so I'm curious from both of you, like what the hell is happening?
Well, what's happening now what was happening after that?
What happened and what is happening?
Okay, so
Wikipedia has like a hard stop at 2002.
So the invasion era, which we brought up, was when WWF bought WCW. And so they framed it as WCW and WWF feuding with each other, and all of the WCW people coming over to challenge the WWF.
I definitely expected you to say getting married the way that Lucky and Albertsons got married. Yours makes more sense though.
And so that was my original like main era of watching it. And so you had one of the outcomes of that was you had wrestlers who had gimmicks that were not entirely dissimilar facing off in the same thing. Where you had Goldberg and Stone Cold, who were always often compared by fans as like who would beat up who. And so that like played out. Like you had all the WCW wrestlers coming over like and doing WWF promos. And so it all sort of merged together. And ECW also came over with its edgier vibe, even in Attitude Era. Like Rob Van Dam was one of the big ECW wrestlers who then came over to the WWF during this. I think they were already WWE at this point because the World Wildlife Fund had already gone after them.
The simple way to put it is that in 2001, all of the existing competition that the WWF had no longer existed.
Yeah.
And so the WWF was like the only mainstream option, and that bred a couple of complications. A, they didn't have another company to compete against. So as far as like putting on a quality product, there was an element where competition did sort of breed a better product. Like both when there used to be multiple companies, they would have to put on really great shows, because if they didn't, they would lose all their fans to the other show, right? With that gone, they weren't the criticism is that they weren't putting on all that great of shows because they didn't have competition, and so they were putting out just like what they could, but there was no real drive to be better, you know?
So what you're saying is that capitalism is okay sometimes.
Yeah, sure. The second thing that became an issue was that they were the only place to work. So it became harder for wrestlers because you couldn't necessarily negotiate between a couple of different places to work. There was only one real big show to work for. So that made it hard on the wrestlers. That also made it hard in that at this point, the WWF had a lot of wrestlers under contract, and there were only so many hours in a television show to feature all of them. And when you put Hulk Hogan and The Rock and The Undertaker and Stone Cold Steve Austin and Triple H and Kane and Kurt Angle and all of these like main eventers, quote unquote, on your show, there's not a whole lot of time for sort of up and coming wrestlers or different style of wrestlers or whatever. So what they did is they ended up doing a brand split. And what that meant was that they made their own competition. So then they had two television shows, which already existed. It's just that they split their employee base in half. And they said, these wrestlers are only going to appear on Monday Night Raw, and these wrestlers are only going to appear on, at the time, SmackDown, Thursday Night SmackDown. And so that's what they did. And so then they treated it as if they were two separate organizations, even though it was all under the WWE. And they did that for a while, and then that didn't really go well. And then they sort of merged everything back. And then as of a couple years ago, they split everything up again. And they said, there's only these wrestlers on Raw and there's only these wrestlers on SmackDown. And yeah, that's at a macro level how the organization of the company has gone over the more recent years.
Yeah, it was the only game in town for a long time. And then now there's all these cool independent promotions.
Yeah, and that was the macro level of just WWE. The biggest thing to come out of the more recent, like past 10, 15 years is the emergence of independent wrestling. And that's where you have a lot of like DIY, independent and local organizations that just put on like really great shows. And there's people that are passionate about wrestling, and WWE's not exactly their vibe. And so they put on these shows that are just a completely different style. There's a lot of influence from like Japan has a certain style of wrestling, and that's gotten a bigger and bigger audience, which is great. Lucha Libre has always been around, at least, locally here. And so you have a lot of different avenues. And so now we're in a good boom period of there's a lot of good wrestling outside of the WWE, even though there's not like a major competitor. And now there sort of is with AEW. Yeah. But even before AEW, you had a lot of really good wrestling to potentially watch. You would just have to seek it out.
And most of the wrestling I've watched recently has been, it's honestly mostly been Hood Slam, which is the independent thing in Oakland. That's been great. And then XSW.
They have Dragon Ball Z characters.
They do. Well, they do straight up have Street Fighter characters in Hood Slam, like Ryu from Street Fighter.
Hood Slam is definitely a copyright risk.
Oh, 100%. I would be very nervous if I was them. They straight up used the Sega logo for a long time.
But you have people that are just genuinely having fun with professional wrestling these days.
And they're weekly now, which is crazy.
Holy shit. Yeah.
They're every Friday.
Hood Slam is?
Yeah.
Oh, wild.
It reminds me a lot of Extremely Serious Wrestling.
It does.
Which, with a kind of a... Hood Slam definitely focuses a lot on the physical, like, fighting aspects, like people being thrown around.
But you've still got, like, joke parody funny characters like the Berkeley Brawler, who's like a Cal student who rides a Razor scooter to the ring. And so speaking of, we wanted to talk about some of my favorite originally, but Uncle B, feel free to I wanted to talk about some of my favorite gimmicks. It's going to be sort of quick overviews of who they were, and Uncle B, feel free to pitch in with any of yours. My first is El Santo, who was a luchador from Mexico who was just so obsessed with not letting anyone see his face at all in public that when he had to testify in court because someone wrote a comic about him, he wrapped his head in bandages and put on sunglasses and claimed he had suffered a wrestling injury, and that was why he had to cover his face. He was only seen in public once without his mask, and that was after he had retired. He went on a talk show, didn't tell anyone that he was going to remove his mask, and then just did it for a second and put it down, and then died a week later. So it's
Holy
seen
shit.
as like his knowing farewell of knowing he was dying. He was also in a bunch of B movies, including...
Or he didn't know that if he would take off the mask, he would die.
That is
Maybe
also...
he's ageless and he was getting like his power from his mask, and he was finally like, you know what, El Santo, it's time. And
I
so
love
he
that.
wanted the world to see his face.
I like that. I like your take.
And so that's why it was buried with him. If someone were to dig it up and wear his mask, they too would become possessed by the spirit of the wrestling deity that possessed El Santo.
Because he was buried in his mask, which is just crazy to me. He had like a fake passport with him, a photo of him with his mask on, because he told people that was what his passport looked like. And the government was like, you can't have it on your real passport, but we'll give you a second one where you do have it on. And he like traveled separately from his crew so they wouldn't see him take the mask off at customs. He had like a whole deal where he would get taken to a back room and only seen by one person out of his mask to prove it was him before he'd come back in. He did movies, and he would only do the movies with the condition that he didn't have to take his mask off. So like there's a movie where he's playing a cop and he just has the mask on. Mostly he played a luchador superhero who had a cave underneath his mansion where he fought crime out of.
I think he was a luchador superhero.
He did actually fight the vampire women. That's the most famous Santo movie because Mystery Science Theater 3000 did that, and they've posted it on YouTube, so we'll have a link to that in the show notes. My second one is, and this was my childhood favorite, he's The Undertaker, who is one of the icons of the WWE. My preferred form is the Dead Man form, where he's essentially a zombie who is impervious to pain. And as you mentioned, Paul Heyman played Paul Bearer, his manager, who had an urn that he could use to restore the strength of the Undertaker from ringside. And he would like sit up like a corpse. He buried people alive in his matches.
Fun fact: I spent the change and I bought they had a replica of the Undertaker's urn on WWE Shop, and so I bought that after I went to WrestleMania in San Jose. I was on such a wrestling high at the moment, and so I bought that. I put it up in my bookshelf in my apartment here. I have like a very classy like light that shines on it, and it's in like a glass dome, and people come over and they'll always ask me what is that, and then I'll have to be like, that's the Undertaker's urn. Whoever holds it controls the Undertaker.
Oh yeah,
and,
there's that too. He's a great example
of the urn. You have control over the Undertaker.
Yeah, he like initially couldn't really talk, just like CLON. Then there's later versions. I don't want to talk about it, but he was a biker for a while. Limp Bizkit's Rollin' was his entrance song. He rode a Harley to the ring, but I prefer to not think about that part of The Undertaker's career. So I'm going to think about happier things, like my last gimmick I'm going to bring up, which is the Hurricane, which is such a fun gimmick.
I got to tell you, I am so happy to hear that the Hurricane is on your, at least the top 3 wrestlers of all time that you'd like to talk about.
100%. Like, I love the Hurricane. For those who don't know, he's a cheesy superhero who had like a sequined green cape, and his entrance video featured him flying around the world, and he'd occasionally give a thumbs up as he flew around. He did all the like Batman 66 style lines. Like his sidekick Mighty Molly in the entrance video said, "Holy sidekick, Hurricane, it's Mighty Molly." He had the Hurricycle. She rode to the ring with her. Oh, and then she betrayed him, and he had other sidekicks, including Super Stacy and Rosie. And I just love the Hurricane. He's so silly. He's come back after a time away because crime has returned to the WWE. as he said in an interview with Gregory Helms, who looks suspiciously like the Hurricane. I don't know why they look so similar, but you know,
I will tell you, out of everybody for you to pick, I will admit to the fact that out of the handful of wrestling shows that I went to in my teens, I made a few signs. That's just a thing that you do. You make signs to hold up at a wrestling show. One of the ones I made was one that said Foley is God for Mick Foley.
Oh, of course.
My mom told me that's inappropriate, so I had to make it say Foley is good. And the one of the other few signs that I made when I went to wrestling shows back in the day is out of Sharpie and on a green poster board with Sharpie and whiteout. I made the Hurricane logo because I was a big Hurricane fan.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I just love the Hurricane so much.
He was a big idiot, but he was a great guy.
He was a total idiot. That was one of the best parts of the character. So he wanted to be a hero so much, but he was just so stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would say, like, as far as talking about like wrestling characters, I think you're spot on. Obviously, talking about The Undertaker, that's going to be your biggest example by far of like somebody that's had sort of the biggest impact with like such a completely different thing compared to everything else in professional wrestling. Another one that I would put out there for you, I just said his name a little bit earlier, but Mick Foley, that's a big guy for me growing up, especially feeling like a complete like weird outcast when you're talking about the late 90s. Mick Foley, for a kid like me, was an example of like, oh, you can be a complete weirdo and fit in because here's this guy who is a little schlubby and like is missing some of his teeth, is missing like an entire ear, has like weird hair, and he's in the WWF with like a bunch of bodybuilder dudes,
and has like 5 characters that he plays.
Oh yeah. Outside of the character work that the guy did, which you could talk about for a long time, Mick Foley, for the most part, for me, was just an example of like, oh yeah, I can do whatever the hell I want because this guy has no reason to fit in here, but he's my favorite dude there. You know,
I love that about him. That is. I love, if it was my favorite like wrestlers, Mick Foley would absolutely be on there. And I love that his Cactus Jack gimmick was inspired by like a Western RPG he played by mail. Like he had a Western character named Cactus Jack, and that was where he got the name from.
Oh, hell yeah. Emily, would you like to hear how Mick Foley lost his ear?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So there's a move that he would do where his opponent would throw him into the ropes, and what Mick Foley would do is he would bear with me here. Just visualize this with me. You've got the 3 ropes of the ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
You with me so far?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So take the top rope and the middle rope. What Mick Foley would do is he would run in such a way that he would put his head between the top and the middle rope, and then he would flip himself over to where he would make those ropes sort of trade places with one another. And so his head would be stuck in between the 2 ropes because it would have made sort of like a little cross section. Are we with me?
Oh,
yes.
Wow.
Okay. So Mick Foley would do this, and it was just a move he did that like was a way to like be like, oh, I'm choking, and it was sort of a signature move of his, but in an opposite, way of using that term, because it wasn't like something he did to somebody else. This was something that he did in every match that was like, oh, I'm choking again. I'm in this precarious position. And so he would do this. He was wrestling a match. I don't know where exactly off the top of my head. It was either Japan or Mexico. Let's go with Japan. And he did that move. But the problem is that whoever set up the ring tightened the ropes a little too tight that night. So usually they're a little bit loose so that they bounce and they have a little bit of give. Whoever tightened the ropes that night, they were particularly tight. So Mick Foley doesn't know this. He goes to do this move where he, sort of, folds his head into these ropes and makes it to where it simulates choking him. And it is so tight that when he goes to do it, the ropes scrape across the side of his face and rip off his, I think, right ear.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And so the piece of his ear flings off. And I don't even know if he's able to do the full choking thing because
his ear has been ripped off.
But his ear's been ripped off, and ultimately he finishes the match.
What?
The complete right side of his head is like bloody. But he finishes the match because I'm sure it was supposed to be like a gruesome match anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not really out of the question that there would be blood. And so he finishes the match. They take him to the back, and either he or somebody else actually grabbed the ear.
Oh my
God. Had flown off. They had retrieved the ear. And so he goes to the hospital. He's taken to the hospital with the ear piece. And when he's in the hospital, there's a language barrier because he's in a country that's not English speaking. And there's a language barrier. He's a little bit out of it. And the nurse that's tending to him, if I'm remembering this story correctly, the nurse that's tending to him gets the information that he's a professional wrestler, that he was injured in a match. And she sees the earpiece and she goes, "Oh, it's all fake anyway, isn't it?" And she thought that the ear was fake. And so she threw the ear away.
No!
Yeah. Yeah.
No! Oh my God! What?
And that's not even... That's not even...
podcast here with Emily's reaction.
Oh! Oh my God!
That's not even the only story of Mick Foley getting grievously injured and continuing to finish the match either.
Oh
no,
my
not
God.
at all.
Oh my God.
So anyway, I mean, you said you wanted to hear the story about how his ear got ripped off.
It's such a good story.
That is an excellent fucking story. And I hope to good that nothing that violent happens on CLON 3. I hope that Justin...
Way to bring it back. I'm sure that Justin would give a lot for his craft, but let's hope that he doesn't have to lose an ear over it.
Same with Riley. Oh my gosh. Well, now I'm just thinking about that Twilight Zone episode where a guy makes a bet that he won't talk for a year and he'll get a bunch of money, and he completes it. And his friend is like, "I didn't think you could do it. Like, I didn't think that you could not talk because you talk all the time." And then the guy like dramatically pulls down his scarf to reveal that his vocal cords have been removed. So I really hope that doesn't happen to Riley.
I hope it doesn't happen to either of them. Yeah, that would be a real tragedy.
Well, we saw Riley speaking at the Twitch Q&A, so
at least as of
today.
To date this, as of February 10th, 2020, Riley Soloner can still speak.
Wow.
Hopefully he'll be able to on February 12th with CLON 3, the Song of the Summer,
where he returns with Justin Angermeyer to save the world one last time. Thank you so much for joining us, Uncle B.
You.
And regaling us with gruesome tales of professional wrestling. Everyone should check out Xtremely Serious Wrestling. Everyone should check out Justin Angermeyer's other shit. And you should also check out some wrestling things.
Yeah, and I'll do a shameless plug right now. If you want to listen to me talk about wrestling for even longer, there's a podcast called Did You Reddit? And they did an episode where they took a deep dive down the Squared Circle subreddit, and then we got super off topic and just talked about wrestling for the uninitiated for a long time. And they gave me entirely too much wine, and so I just babble about pro wrestling for a long time. So you can find that on the interwebs,
and we'll include the link to that in our show notes.
And if you want to hear Uncle B talk even more about wrestling, send him some wine.
No.
Good night and good CLON, friends.
Well, good night and good CLON, friends. Check all this good shit out. Good night and good CLON.
You deserve this. You are a genius. You're a living legend. You're a big, strong, powerful guy. And you're hot. And you're a totally hot guy. Oh, gosh.